Hello, everybody. Halloween is right around the corner, which means it's the perfect time to talk about the one genre you've been begging me to cover, and that's horror. Of all the genres I haven't covered, horror by far has been your #1 request, and I hear ya. The problem is, I'm not a horror writer. Because of this, I decided to bring in the big guns. Today, I'm interviewing international best-selling author Daniel Wilcox. Dan specializes in dark fiction. This includes sci-fi, post-apocalyptic, and of course, horror. On top of that, he's 1/5 of the digital story studio, Hawk and Cleaver. He's also co-producer for both The Other Stories and the Great Writers Share podcast. Basically, he's a guy who knows a ton about the craft of writing as well as the writing industry. I gathered your questions and polled my patrons over on Patreon in order to come up with your 10 most popular questions about writing horror, and Dan is here to answer them today. On top of that, we may or may not be holding a giveaway. You can win a signed copy of Twisted by Daniel Wilcox, which features 28 dark horror short stories. I've read it myself. It's so good. You definitely want to win. All you have to do to enter is click the link in the description below and sign up. You only have 1 week to enter, so do it now. It's in the description. Get on it. Before we get started, if you like your fiction both dark and fantastical, don't forget my dark fantasy novel, The Savior's Sister, was released just this month, or actually it was released last month. It's available in ebook, paperback, and hardback at all major retailers. I have the links listed below. Pick up a copy today. And if you want more writing and publishing tips, be sure to subscribe to my channel and ring that bell. I post videos on Wednesdays with bonus content on Mondays. On to your 10 questions all about writing horror. Dan the man, thank you so much for joining me today. Would you like to take a minute to introduce yourselves and tell folks a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Hi, no, thank you for having me on the show. I'm incredibly excited to be here. I've been watching your content for a while. I think it's going to be awesome getting the chance to talk to you and answer some of these questions. And as someone who is currently working for a Savers champion, I just want to say that I'm a big fan of your work as well. So thank you for the kind words about me. You're very welcome. So yeah, you said it. I'm Daniel Wilcox. I am 1/5 of digital story studio Hawk and Cleaver. I am one of the co-founders of the Other Stories podcast, which is a short horror fiction podcast which has, since its inception in 2016, accrued nearly 7 million downloads across the globe. I am a best-selling fiction author. I've got my own books and novels. And I am recently, as of this year, now the CEO of a horror publishing imprint, which is Devil's Rock Publishing. So that is me.
That's awesome. Oh my gosh. And congratulations, CEO. No big deal. No big deal.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun so far.
Would you mind starting things off by giving us an idea of what qualifies as horror? Maybe a bit about some of the subgenres or how it differentiates itself from other similar genres.
Horror stories tend to be stories that center around, obviously, the scary, the terrifying, usually striking on the theme of playing with people's fear. It tends to be an atmosphere, a flavor you can get in a lot of genres. So you can find that you get horror elements in certain stories. Certainly the Savior's Champion has a few dark elements that could be qualified as horror, but to get a full horror book, it tends to be focusing entirely around that theme of fear. They vary a little bit from other genres in the sense that you don't often get the happy endings, because for some reason freaks like me like to read the miserable and get to the end and just like to see people suffer. Oftentimes there'll be supernatural elements, though not always. Sometimes you can go straight into psychological horror and really mess with the real world, which I think in many ways can be some of the scariest forms of horror. And it's very, very character driven. So in order to write a successful horror book, in my opinion, and certainly in the opinion of people across the horoscope, you really want to find characters that people can identify with, because if you don't have the emotional connection, the emotional draw of your main character and your reader, then you're not going to get into their heads. You're not going to be able to strike that fear that you want to get that really defines a horror novel. And of course, there's the element of exploring all the macabre and the taboo and all the dark sides of life that people tend to try and avoid when they can.
I talk a lot about how I love a book with a happy ending, and people will be like, even in like horror, I'm like, no, I'm talking about like adventures or romance. Horror, like you go into that knowing that it's not going to end well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I still find that I'll read a horror book, and there's something about reader psychology where even though I've read dozens of horror books, hundreds of horror books, even though I write horror, I still go into horror books and root for people to make it to the end. And as recently as a few months ago, I was reading a book by a guy called Christopher Golden. The book's called Ararat, and I got to the last few chapters and I really thought the group that was at the end was going to stick together and make it, and spoiler alert, they don't. But the fact that I can even have those experiences where I'm thinking, oh, they're going to make it, and then they don't, it's just a testament to what readers feel when they're going through a journey.
So the next question, number 2, I'm going to start with the most obvious question we have. How do you make shit scary?
Now, that is a big question because it will vary for absolutely everyone. So you cannot write a horror book that will scare every single reader. I'd say the number one advice I'd give is try and scare yourself, because the best way to instill fear successfully into the heart of the people you're trying to read is just dig into the stuff that you're scared of. Are you afraid of the dark? Are you afraid of heights? Are you afraid of creatures? Are you afraid of death? There's 1,000 different things that people are afraid of. And it's about finding those sort of really raw nerves and finding a way to play with that with your characters to reach your reader. I tend to find that I like to keep my horror stories very personally focused. So it's not often a story about, say, fantasy where you explore a lot more of the world, whereas horror, or the ones that I read and see a lot more, are the ones that are very focused in on a particular character. It can sometimes be first person, sometimes third person. I find I love writing first person when I'm writing short stories because I can really dig into the heart of a reader and really sort of get across the feelings of the character quite quickly without having to world build. One thing that I personally love about horror, and part of the reason that I write horror, is that I like to explore the things that do scare the shit out of me, because only in understanding the unknown can you really get over that fear. So for me, it's a great way to explore death, the fear of losing loved ones. I used to have a fear of floppy disk drives. They don't exist anymore. So thankfully, that's a whole horror gone for me. I'll explain that another time. I think people should know this anyway, but for people who haven't read horror, you don't go into horror expecting a good time all the way through. Certainly, you have to have lifts in the character's journey in order to get the troughs. But at the same time, a lot of it is building that tension, keeping that unsettled atmosphere going straight through the book. One huge rule is you want to hide the monster for as long as possible, and this is something that you'll see again and again, particularly in the big works, where you can tease the monster in the beginning. And by monster, I don't physically mean vampire or werewolf. I mean like the monster being the horror element. You want to hide that for as long as possible, because nothing is scarier to a reader than the thing that they can't see. So if you have a room that you're inside, it's black, and you have no idea what's there, you can hear it, you can smell it, you can taste it in the air. That stuff is 1,000 times scarier than switching on the light and showing them what the creature is. The longer you can hold on to that is my number one tip when it comes to horror. The longer you can hold on to that particular moment of what the hell is this, the longer you have the reader in the palm of your hand. And then when it comes to the reveal at the end, that really has an impact. And even when it comes to that reveal, what I do see a lot of early horror writers do is try to over-describe. So you might want to describe this perfect mix of, I don't know, goblin and werewolf and dragon, all these things thrown in together. It could just be Pennywise the clown. But the more vague you can get in your description to lead people gently in a certain direction and leave the rest of it to their imaginations to create, the more you're going to impact that particular reader, because you're not stealing the experience of defining what it is. You're letting them come up with a horror in their own head. I think that's so key when it comes to writing horror. And the final part, which I kind of alluded to there as well, play with the senses, because horror is very, very primal. Fear is very, very primal. And within fear, a lot of that comes from instinct. A lot of that comes with just our biology. So it might be certain smells set you off and freak you out. Like I know friends that particular smells set them off. I know people that hate the touch of cotton wool, things like that. If you can really dig into particular smells, tastes, touches, then you're really going to create a 3D experience in horror for the reader.
I loved that you mentioned, even when you reveal the monster, keep it vague, because I can think of this more so in movies than books, but when the monster is finally revealed and then you see it, there have been so many times where I'm like, well, that's not scary to me. It was probably scary to whoever created it, but to me, I'm like, well, that just looks stupid, you know? Yes. And so if you can keep it vague, thinking about specifically movies, the monsters that I found the scariest were the ones that even when they were revealed, they were mostly cloaked in darkness. So you couldn't really see their whole figure, and you just kind of had to guess in your mind. And I think it, allows people to envision the monster as something they find scary. So it's like personally scary to each reader.
For me was in the Harry Potter films when they actually revealed Voldemort in the films, because they built him up. Obviously, they tease him in Philosopher's Stone, and then they build him up and build him up and build him up. But he just didn't deliver for me when he showed it for Goblet of Fire. And I know people will probably be shaking their fists at the screen, but for me, it didn't, because I saw so much worse in my head. And obviously, they can't do that for a PG film.
I completely agree. So the next question, we're hitting a contentious topic, at least here on my channel: planning versus pantsing. How do you plan your horror stories, if at all? Do you start with a monster and build from there? there? Do you know the end before you begin, or do you just pants the whole thing?
I mean, as you've probably come across on your channel lots of time, there's no right answers to this. My method will definitely not be the way that other people work, but I would say that if it was on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being a pantser and 10 being a plotter, I tend to stick around the 3 or the 4. I love having a premise, and I love having an idea, and I like having a feel for a book that I'm trying to write. But I don't like to go too deep into the weeds of it, because I love the process of discovery. I find that with short stories, I will just pure pantser. I will come up with a vague concept and just run with it. So an example of that is I'm currently putting together an anthology which will be live as of this episode hits. And in that anthology, the story that I wrote is about 6,500 words, and the theme is around what comes after death, so afterlife. And for that story, I had an idea of a man sitting on a tiny little island surrounded by this black sea, just sitting under the universe, the cosmos, after he's dead, and different islands springing up around him, and different people appearing, and how do you connect those islands, and him trying to work out how to connect to people and all this kind of stuff. And that was it. That was the idea I went into. I started writing, and I've written this story now that follows that sort of idea, but it twists and turns along the way. It gets a bit more darker. But with short stories, I tend to just literally sort of run at it and just give it a go, because for me, short stories are very cathartic. It's very nice to experiment with them and just see where it goes. With the longer works, the example I'll use here will be my current work in progress, which is When Winter Comes, which is a serialized version of a horror story. The idea for that, I literally had the idea for the intro chapter. I came up a writers group with the idea of a blizzard hitting a town in northern Alaska, a core group of essentially children, 14, 15-year-olds, and how would they cope under the weight of that storm. So a bit more apocalyptic than horror. So I get these little threads of nuggets, and I build up upon that idea, and then I'll sit generally for a few hours, maybe a couple of days, and just flesh out some of the characters, get an idea of who I want to be in there, how will they link together, what are the tension points between them, because if you just have 3 random characters in a scenario like that, all you've got is 3 characters that are struggling to survive. Whereas if you add maybe a brother and a sister who are torn apart, or lovers that have fallen out, or someone who's cheating on their wife or something, add those real bits of conflict, and that's where you have a story, because you need to create the things that are going to pull people together, the things that transcend as humanity above what that horror in the story is, in order to really make it complex, bring it together, and make the reader interested. You can't just chuck horror at a particular person and hope that everything's going to be okay. You have to really create it. So that's how I tend to work. I'll create these sort of web of characters, I'll create a couple of defining features, and then I'll put my fingers to the keyboard and just go. I will also add as well that for this latest book, which is the first time I've actually done this in a long while, is I have actually planned the ending already, or at least I know where the book's heading. And then the rest of it's just sort of a journey for discovery on the way there.
I love that. I especially love that you map out sort of the tension points between the characters, because I'm sort of the reverse of you on the scale of plotter to pantser. I'm closer to like an 8 with being towards plotter. But the things that I like to discover in the book are how tensions are going to arise between people. Like, for example, I'll know these 2 characters eventually are not going to get along, but I don't know why or how, or what's the thing that's going to set it off. And that's what I like to discover, is the relationships. And I like how yours is kind of the reverse. And it just goes to show that like everyone has their own method, and you got to do what works for you. But I always find that really, really interesting.
Absolutely.
So the next question, horror tends to rely on spooky visuals and appropriate pacing. What's your advice for creating a balance between providing enough imagery to make things scary while also keeping the appropriate pace?
So it totally depends upon the type of horror story you're trying to tell. You can look at works like Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House, where it's a lot more about the house, it's a lot more about these characters and the way that the house sort of responds to them and implies all the ghosts and things. So in those scenarios, you really want to focus on building a real picture of what the house is, how each thing interacts with each other, sort of the intricacies of the layout, the floor plans, anything that works around there. But then with other books, more sort of psychological horrors, so you can look at Josh Malerman's Bird Box, you have a bit more in the way of dialogue and people discussing the threat and sort of experiencing the threat as it goes. So I think it depends on the type of story that you're telling, and it also depends on how you as a storyteller want to tell it. Dean Koontz tends to be a lot more descriptive with his prose. He'll go right into the architecture, the styles, sort of the brand, everything about how he wants you to see the picture. Whereas there are some people that are a lot more minimal in their writing style and want you to imagine it for yourself. So there's not really a right way to go. I think just the important thing is to try and get the peaks and troughs of your story to try and keep that pace going. One thing that's useful is I often like to paint the picture of what readers can expect very, very early on. So in When Winter Comes, that first scene basically just gives the reader a glimpse at some of the action that's going to be coming up later. And then there's a bit of a gap in the beginning where we explore the characters, start to get them into their threatening situations before we see anything again of that first intro scene. One of the biggest mistakes you can make is to start off very, very happy for a few chapters and then go into dark, because horror readers, they're just not after that. They like to get straight into what is the problem, what is wrong. And if you spend too long just being happy and introducing everyone in sort of like a really happy way, everything's lovely, then that generally doesn't seem to go down well. I mean, you can think of films like Jurassic Park, in which you don't see the dinosaurs for a lot of the film, but that first scene you see something of the velociraptor in the cage, and just as an opening scene, that builds attention, that shows you something's going to happen. It foreshadows later on in the film, and it gives you a bit of an arc to follow as you go along. And then when you've got all the happy bits, it's already unsettled because you know that something bad's going to happen. In terms of just keeping pacing going, one of the basics of obviously writing is if you have those shorter, sharper sentences when you're trying to have the fast-paced action scenes. Oftentimes the last few chapters of a horror novel will be very fast. Like, just the whole thing will just be fast-paced. Things are happening, the monster's being revealed, people are fighting, there's death, there's action, there's a whole lot. So the big chunk at the end, I think, don't feel as if you're going wrong if you are just getting faster and faster and faster until you eventually smash into that brick wall. And as I mentioned before, it's easy to get sucked into over-describing, so just try and keep it pared back, let the reader do a lot of the imagining, and that will also help you not get bogged down in too many details, because you'll be surprised how minimal you can go in order to induce horror in a reader.
I love that you mentioned the part about starting the book with a taste of, what's going to come later. I think that is a rule that is maybe, I don't like to say anything as like definitive, but maybe almost universal, because I don't write horror and I like to do the same thing. People always comment like, oh, it's a Jenna Moreci book because someone dies or someone gets beat up in the very first scene. The very first scene is someone dying or someone getting the shit beat out of them. And I'm like, well, that's because I'm letting readers know this is what the book is going to be like. And maybe the next couple of scenes or the next few chapters aren't going to be that way, but just wait a second, because we're coming back to the blood and guts and everything. So it's on its way.
Like you say, you need to set the tone of what you're expecting, because if you've got a few, planned 3 or 4 chapters of just people getting to know each other and getting to know the world, and then you get into horror, people are going to feel cheated, or they might not know it's a horror book, depending on like your cover and everything else. And it just erases that straight away and just gets to the heart of what you're trying to do.
The next question: tension seems to be another key ingredient in horror. What advice do you have for handling tension?
So in horror, I would argue that tension is one of the core components that threads all of your book together. I think with other genres, you have a lot more rises and falls, and there are certain elements where readers don't necessarily want tension. You want, a bit of action, a bit of conflict, and then maybe in the next scene you have your characters sitting around the campfire and just talking and getting to know each other. And in other genres that works, because some people really like just building up the relationship between the characters and whatnot. But with horror, it's a constant tightrope walk to the finish, and you have to have the parts where you're almost going to fall off the rope, but ultimately you have to stay on that rope. You have to keep that tension nice and tight. And generally, if there's too much of a lull in tension, that will bore readers. So it doesn't mean to pack every single second with tension, because again, you have to have moments to breathe, to appreciate what's going on. But ultimately, if you feel like there is a bit of a quiet point, then you can just add a bit of tension there. By all means, have someone, if they're just coming home from a day at work and they're in the house, like, it's very, very easy just to say that they're alone, or they think they should be alone, and then hear the shower going off, and then casting all these aspersions of who's in the shower, what is it going on, and all these images, and you can really dig into the character's head and start to go into what they might be thinking. Like, is it someone coming to kill them? What if they use this as a weapon? Oh, what happens if they're going to open the door? Should they phone someone? All of these questions you throw out create that tension, and you can really take a moment like that was previously untense and just string it together and stretch it out until you really got the reader sort of on tenterhooks, wondering what the hell's going on. So it's finding ways to hook these in. It's finding ways to create the mystery and intrigue that just keeps driving that plot forward. Ultimately, the best way to create tension is to keep stringing along that unknown, to have your character ask questions, to dive into their fears and exacerbate how their fears would apply to a particular situation.
Next question: would you say there is a common formula to writing horror, or specific structural elements that are pivotal to the genre?
The big one that I've seen is 90% of traditional horror, the protagonist is unprepared for the horror that they're facing. So coming back to that needing to connect with the reader is generally people in very day-to-day lives. They're people with typical problems. They might have sort of a unique and individual job. So coming back to Christopher Golden's Ararat, they are archaeologists and they've discovered Noah's Ark inside of a mountain. So they've got this quite exotic job. But beneath it all is the relationship between the two characters. They have, money problems, wealth problems, like family, all that kind of stuff. That's the bond that brings it together. Horror is very based around humanity and the fundamentals of what makes us human, because when everything's stripped back and, all that's left is who you are, all you have is your fear, your love, your emotions, hunger, all that kind of stuff. People will die along the way. That will happen. No one is precious. I have learned. No one is precious. Oftentimes the main character doesn't make it to the end and the proxy will carry his mantle or her mantle. But yeah, no matter how attached you get to a character, they can and they will all die. So other genres will dictate that you have a core group of characters that you keep alive, and you can't really, if you kill them, the readers will just stop reading that book. I find as well that a big part of it is the deterioration of the mental state. So you start off with characters who are, just in their day-to-day, they're kind of relatively happy with how things are going. The monster comes, they have to deal with this, things elevate, the monster gets closer, takes people they love, blah, 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 blah. And towards the end, you have this really, and this is the part that I really like diving into, it's that psychological state of what is fear? How do different characters react in different situations? Do they get less talkative? Do they get more aggressive? Do they just collapse entirely and just become mute? Like there's so many ways to explore it, but generally you can monitor the character's deterioration as you go through the story. And you could argue that a lot of horror stories do fit into the sort of general 3-act structure. So yeah, act 1 would be your setup with the monster and the characters and sort of introducing the reader to what's going on. Act 2 would be the monster's mischief and the monster having lots of fun and really digging into sort of what problems this monster is going to be causing to the day-to-day lives of your main characters. And then act 3 is obviously the revenge of the main character, usually at the expense of something they love dearly. So this is where, if you want to tie a theme of it into maybe the character is struggling to learn to love, and there's a woman that he's had this sort of close relationship for ages and he just won't commit. Maybe at the end he realizes how much he loves her, but it's too late and she's gone because it's horror. But you can really sort of play with those themes and thread them in. But act 3 is generally obviously where the monsters come out in their full force. Generally they do get defeated, but there's normally an expensive price to pay at the end.
I love touching on this because from my experience, just in terms of critiquing and things like that in the past, usually the problem that a lot of newbie writers have is structural. They don't understand the structure of their genre. Next question. One word that's often thrown around by readers is cliche. What do you recommend for writers who want to create a scary story without relying on predictable horror cliches?
This is probably one of the trickiest questions to handle, because you cannot escape cliche, but you can find ways to work around it. Number one, I think if you're starting off on a horror journey and you're either early in your writing career or you're just getting started, don't be afraid of cliche. I'd argue lean into it. Get familiar with where the monsters came from, what type of things they can invoke, play around with the mess and the chaos that they can create. Absorb yourself in the classic monsters. I mean, obviously you're looking like zombies, your werewolves, vampires, but yeah, just lean into the cliches a bit, play around with them, because you have to experiment a little bit with the monsters in order to get to understand the genre. So there are 1,000 stories about zombies, but many of them are different. I mean, you've had the slow moving zombie that sort of staggers around, eats brains. You've had the super fast zombies in the film version of I Am Legend. You have intelligent zombies, you have dumb zombies, it's a whole spectrum of them. So these are people who have taken that original concept and then played with them. Same with vampires and werewolves. You have your traditional only come out at night, turn into a bat, and then you have sparkly Edward and Jake, and you knew it was going there. But yeah. But the point is, you can play with them and you can put a spin on it. And I think the thing you have to be careful of is to try not to force something that doesn't feel natural, or try and force a change just for the sake of it. I think it really has to contribute to the story you're trying to tell and really make a difference in terms of how your characters react, what the world will be, and what that change serves as a purpose. Like nobody can write Frankenstein twice. If you put Frankenstein in a story of your own, it's going to be different. There are cliches that you follow, but at the same time you can add enough of what is you to make it different enough that it's no longer a cliche.
People are always asking, how do I avoid XYZ tropes? How do I avoid XYZ cliches? First of all, there is absolutely no avoiding tropes, because there are like millions of tropes out there. There are going to be tropes in your book. So whenever I hear people say, my book has no tropes, I'm like, are you sure? I find that very hard to believe. The difference between a trope and a cliche is a trope is a very common situation in a book. A cliche is when it's done the same exact way it's been done a million times to the point where it's boring. So exactly like what you said, you just take something that's been done before, but you put your own spin on it, you make it yours. And that's what makes it fresh and exciting, is when you take something that's been done a lot and you're like, okay, but has it been done this way before? Has it been done my way? And that's what makes it special. Or if you take a cliche and you flip it on its head, you subvert it. I love when people do that.
Yes.
So those are some of my favorites. So next question, if someone wants to write a horror story but doesn't know where to drum up ideas, we touched on this a little bit before, but what would you recommend? Do you draw inspiration from your personal fears? I know you do because you mentioned that, but do you also look for genre trends, current events, etc.?
Personally, I'd recommend, or my recommendation would be what I'd say for any reader looking at writing any genre, which is just read that genre. Find books that you think would interest you. Horror is an entire spectrum of different books, same as any other genre. So there'll be some that are a bit lighter, there'll be some that are very, very heavy. One good place to start that I'd recommend would be to go to places like the Horror Writers Association's website, where they've got the Bram Stoker Award winners. So if you want to read the creme de la creme of horror each year, they have the list of all the different winners in Best Novel, Best Short Story, Best First Novel, all that kind of stuff. So that's always a good place to sort of see what's resonating with the horror community and get familiar with what horror is. One thing I would say as well is that I personally am not a consumer of horror films generally. I've watched a fair amount of horror films in my time. I'm much more of a horror reader. And I would argue that watching horror and reading horror is an entirely different experience, because there's something about the written language in horror that I find pulls me into to want to keep writing, want to keep reading. It's bizarre, and this is something I've always struggled to explain to people whenever they ask why I write horror, but the fact that you can write a sentence and make someone feel physically sick. Do you know what I mean? Like the fact you can write a sentence and make someone physically cry, someone physically just, shiver, just whatever. The fact that you can use words within like a 5-6 word sentence and make someone feel that way. That's what I love about horror. I love finding those pulls, those phrases, those turns of phrases that really sort of connect with the reader and make you feel that emotion. And you don't quite get that if you're watching, splatter gore porn in some film. Short stories are a good place to start as well. There's thousands of short story collections. I've mentioned before the Other Stories podcast, which is mine and Horton Cleaver's podcast, in which we have 20-minute short horror stories every Monday on the podcast feed for free. So you can check those out. There are literally hundreds of those stories now. One of my starting places before I actually got into writing horror was a collection of short stories by Stephen King called Everything's Eventual, which for me, that was more of a case of me just falling in love with Stephen King. Not all those stories are horror, but there was still enough horror in there that I was like, okay, this is what I want to write. Read some Stephen King. And I say some because you cannot build a horror career based off of what Stephen King does, because Stephen King is a brand. He is a genre. Don't emulate everything he does, but he is fantastic. If obviously you want to see one of the masters work at creating horror, read books like Pet Sematary or It or Cujo. Like Cujo's phenomenal for just building tension and taking such a small situation and just expanding it into this incredible story. There are craft books as well. So Stephen King has On Writing, which is more of a general craft book, but there's some good lessons in there. And one that I haven't read yet, but I have seen and is on my to be read list, is a book by Tim Wagner called Writing in the Dark. I'm sure he'll have some fantastic lessons in there, because I've read some of his stuff and it's incredible. And as we said, think about what scares you. I'll often have, just going from my day-to-day life, moments in which a scenario strikes me and I just think, oh, this would be fun to explore. And people who listen to this are going to be very much judging horror people, but I assure you I'm a nice person in real life. But one scenario that comes to mind that I literally had the other day was I went to the shops and took my son, did the big food shop, came back, put him in the car, went to go put the trolley back, and in my head I went, what if I turn around and he's just not in the car?
I shouldn't laugh, but I know what you mean. I know exactly what you mean.
So it's just those moments where you suddenly panic. Pay attention to what really pulls at your heart. And like at some point, I'm probably going to put that into a story somewhere. And it's not because I don't love my son, because I do. He's everything. But it's those things you have to be aware of. And that's what I was saying earlier, when you have to be unafraid to explore, because you will generally start going into horror in one of two ways: either too timid, in which you're worried about grossing people out or affecting people too much, or way too over descriptive and grotesque. And it's about playing with it, dialing that back, finding that sort of sweet spot for you. And that's the only place you can really start then, is by putting pen to paper and writing.
I just love that you mentioned, like, I love that I can write a sentence and make people sick, because I can so relate. Like when a reader or a beta reader hits me up like, Jenna, you bitch, I hate you. I'm like, yay, victory, I did it. And it's funny because it's like, I feel like to be a writer, you have to be like a little bit sadistic, just like just a tiny, teeny bit. So I can relate.
There's a short story that I highly recommend to anyone who wants to explore this, but only if you've got a strong stomach. It's a short story by Chuck Palahniuk, who is the author of Fight Club, and he wrote a short story called Guts, which is pretty much famous for making people pass out because, and I've heard him speak about this on the podcast, he deliberately has parts in it where he gets your heart racing because of certain points. There's certain like chanting phrases into it, and then the peaks and the troughs are literally psychologically designed to get you into a certain state and then pull you back down. And I've read it myself. I didn't faint, but I did go a bit lightheaded. And I will put a warning though. Please consider what you're getting into before you read that one, because it's a very strong story.
Content warning may make you faint. If you have health problems, maybe don't. That's crazy.
Yes, have someone next to you just in case.
Have lots of water, be lying down. So for a lot of genres, it's important to create likable characters. That's not always the case for horror. How important is characterization in this genre? I think you had mentioned before this is very important. But what should writers focus on when crafting their characters?
The key thing is relatability. As I mentioned, you want to find a real connection with the reader, and that's literally the foundation of where the rest of the story starts. If you don't have that connection, that emotional tie, then you're really not going to get anywhere with them. Like if there's somebody in your life that you hate, you don't care what they fear, what they love, what, you know, all that kind of stuff. So it's about finding the humanity in your character and finding the day-to-day things that resonate. I mean, they could be a king, they could be a prince, they could be whatever. There isn't a restriction to what type of character you have. Ultimately, it's those raw connections that pull the reader in and make it so that the rest of the horror works. As I've said, like money, health, family, relationships, tap into what makes you human. There's a guy called Keelan Patrick Burke who's got a few novellas. One of them is called Sour Candy, which is about a general man that goes into the grocery store, and there's a child having a tantrum next to his mum who looks weary. She's absolutely shattered, haggard. This kid is just screaming. He wants whatever it is. And the dad just gives him a side glance, walks away. And this isn't a spoiler. This happens in the first part of the story. But what eventually transpires is he goes home and his wife is missing. Everyone he knows is missing. But the one person who's there now is his child. And the child says that it's his daddy and basically claims him as his daddy. And it's that, for him, the day-to-day connect in that is the fact that he was struggling to commit to this woman. She wanted to have children. He didn't. Many people have that battle with their partners. Many people have conflicting views when it comes to that kind of decision. It's a big decision. And so he suddenly met with this reality of, okay, his girlfriend, who he thought was his girlfriend, is now saying that she's not his girlfriend. And also he now has his son that won't leave him alone. And his entire reality switched around. So it's really playing with what that situation would be like and exploring it, and all of the things that he was worried about happen. And I won't give anything more in the story away, but it's a very, very effective story. And he's got another story as well called Blanky, which is about a mum and dad whose son dies, and all that's left is his Blanky, and the Blanky basically comes to life and starts to try and kill people and things. But it's this worry about, is his son in the blanket? How does it all tie in? Obviously, not everyone has been through losing a child, but lots of people have lost people in their life. So it's really playing with the emotions of what that would be like in that situation. So just find those key core fundamental principles of humanity and just weave them into your character.
I love that you mentioned, relatability, humanity, because I remember this one horror book I read. I don't want to say the name because I didn't like it. And no, I loved yours. Basically, in the book, the main character was this woman. The reason I didn't like the book is because I didn't care what was happening to her. Mm-hmm. I was just sitting there like, just kill her, just kill this woman. And yes. I thought it was because I didn't like her, but there have been plenty of books I've read where the main character, like for example, one of my favorite books is A Clockwork Orange. The main character is a sociopath and a horrible human being, but I really enjoyed that book. And listening to you talk about it, it makes so much more sense because I didn't find that main character relatable in any way. Mm-hmm. All of the issues she was going through, there was nothing that I could personally relate to, and so I didn't really care about her struggles because to me she felt very fictional. It all makes sense now.
Beautiful.
So the last question, what are some current trends in the horror genre and what's your take on them? Do you recommend writing with the trends? Do you recommend paving your own path? What say you?
It's totally up to what you want to achieve as a writer. I don't think there's a right answer to this. I'd argue that I don't really follow trends too much. I have certain styles of horror that I like, and that's what I try and write. Horror is one of those genres that's very, very cyclical, and it comes back in waves. So, there was a big horror push in the 80s, died down a fair bit during the 90s. It started to come back, particularly over the last few years, with social media creating opportunities for horror readers to come together and share everything they love. If you can write a good horror book, it's pretty much going to be good for the ages, because the things that make horror are eternal. So again, just once you put something out there, it's just going to keep coming back, and you'll get new generations of horror readers, new people that join in, and they just stick. I mean, I've got a shelf full of people behind me from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the noughties, the 10s, like all of it, just different horror through the ages. Although one thing that I have noticed over the past few years is the surgence of a genre that isn't really a genre, but people are arguing to make it a genre and don't know whether or not it's a genre yet, which is elevated horror, which focuses a lot less on sort of creatures and blood and a lot more on the psychological component. So coming back to things like Josh Malerman's Bird Box, films like Jordan Peele's Get Out, it's less so about sort of like the gruesome elements and more about the psychological. So that's quite in vogue at the minute for people that want to check out something that people argue are a bit more sophisticated, but it's all horror at the end of the day. There are also at the minute a lot of genres tapping into elements of horror. So if you go onto the horror charts on Amazon, for example, you won't just find horror, you'll find post-apocalyptic, you'll find urban fantasy, thriller, even some mystery books, because coming back to what we were saying at the beginning, that you have some books that have the flavor of horror, although that's not their overarching genre. And it's a path that I'm actually looking at going into. Horror is very, very difficult to serialize or to basically extend past a single book. There are people that can do it in certain ways. You have to sort of manipulate the genre to make it happen. But if you are looking to sort of write longer horror and really create a career out of this, then one suggestion will be to write sort of horror within the other genres. So I have written a few books that are post-apocalyptic with horror, so you can get longer stories out of that if you try. Horror is it's a very tight-knit community, so you'll find that a lot of the same sort of authors mix within particular circles. You'll have a lot of anthologies with the same sort of author names. You'll have sort of the bigger chart toppers will tend to be the same. It's quite a niche subject, so the audience is considerably less than other genres, but they're hungry. If they love you, if you can really get people to love you as an author, they'll consume everything you read, and that's where that growth comes from. And yeah, look into communities like the Horror Writers Association. You can look at This Is Horror, which is a big UK-run horror podcast and website and reviewer and publisher. Horror is eternal, and horror is life. So
Shrek is love, Shrek is life, horror is eternal. Yeah. Horror is life. I love that. That's awesome. So thank you so much for answering all of my questions about horror. You are an absolute legend.
Thank you for having me on.
Of course. Where can everyone go if they want to learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, so the best place to go for me is www.danielwillcocks, and that's WILLCOCKS.com. And you can also check out Devil's Rock Publishing at devilsrockpublishing.com. Okie
dokie. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It was an absolute pleasure. In case you've forgotten, we've got a giveaway going on. Dan is handing out a signed copy of Twisted, which is a collection of 28 horror short stories. Gorgeous. Beautiful. If you want to enter and win a copy of Twisted, all you have to do is click the link in the description below. You've got 1 week to get on it. Click the link. I've read it. It's amazing. You definitely want to win. Link is in the description. Click it. Do it now. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I post new videos on Wednesdays, and if you want to be alerted as soon as I upload, ring that bell. My #1 best-selling dark fantasy romance, The Savior Sister, is available in ebook, paperback, and hardback at all major retailers, so be sure to pick up a copy today and get in on the action. I have all the links listed below. You can't miss them. And be sure to follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, Tumblr, Facebook, and of course, you can tweet me at Jenna Moreci. Bye!
This is Vrondies. Why the fuck haven't you subscribed to Jenna's channel? Do you really want to face me? If you don't do it, you know what will happen. I'll rip out your tongue, torture you, then leave your rotten corpse out for the birds to feast on it. Now press the goddamn button. And the bell too.